Chapter 3. Paddington buys a share. On the first day of his return to number 32 Winter Gardens, Paddington was extremely busy. Apart from all the unpacking he had to do, there were visits to be paid, stories to be told, not once but time and time again. Cupboards to be investigated, old and familiar chairs to be sat in. In fact, all the 1,001 things to do was settling down once more into a normal life at his old home. Everyone was so pleased to see him and to hear all about his trip that the hours seemed to melt away, and by the time he went to bed that evening he felt as if he hadn't been away at all. After weeks of sleeping in a bunk, it was nice to be back in his old bed, especially as during his absence Mr. Brown had redecorated his room so that it now had powder blue walls and gleaming white, freshly painted woodwork, not to mention a notice board for his day-to-day reminders and a brand new carpet on the floor. The old one was getting rather threadbare, explained Mrs. Brown, when she brought him his breakfast in bed the following morning. We've bought you a patterned one, so it won't show your stains quite so much. My stains, Mrs. Brown? Exclaimed Paddington, looking most offended as he sat up in bed rubbing his eyes. Your stains, repeated Mrs. Bird sternly, letting in a flood of sunshine as she drew the curtains. The old carpet was so stiff with dried marmalade, we practically had to saw it in two to get it out of the room. Mrs. Brown looked nervously at Paddington. Have you got anything planned for this morning? She asked. Paddington dipped his paw thoughtfully into the jar of marmalade. Not really, Mrs. Brown, he announced vaguely. There's some special shopping to do, and I want to put my winnings in the bank for safety. A very good idea, said Mrs. Brown. I don't like to think of you carrying all that money around in your suitcase. You'll never know what might happen. Mrs. Brown looked most relieved at Paddington's reply. Things had been unusually quiet just lately at number 32 Winter Gardens, and she'd woken that morning with the nasty feeling that the peace of recent weeks was about to be shattered. I wouldn't go counting your chickens before they're hatched, said Mrs. Bird grimly, when Mrs. Brown gave voice to her thoughts as they were going back downstairs. Although she didn't say anything, the Browns' housekeeper also had the feeling that she was witnessing the quiet before the storm. Nevertheless, try as she might, even Mrs. Bird could find little to grumble at when Paddington appeared at the kitchen door some while later, dressed and ready to greet the morning air. His fur was well brushed, and even his old duffel coat looked unusually respectable as he disappeared out of the house and hurried off down the road in the direction of the Portobello Market, carrying his suitcase in one paw and an important-looking booklet marked Floyd's Bank in the other. Pausing only to call in at the baker's in order to renew his standing order for buns and to have a chat about his various experiences while he had been away, he hurried on towards the antique shop run by his friend Mr. Gruber. Normally, Paddington shared his elevenses with Mr. Gruber, and he wanted to warn his friend that he might be a little late that morning. Paddington was a popular bear with the traders in the market, and his progress down the Portobello Road was much slower than he had intended, so what with one thing and another, by the time he reached the bank it was almost 10 o'clock. However, he was pleased to see that he was first in the queue, and after looking around carefully to make sure no one was watching, he settled himself down on the pavement, withdrew the bundle of notes from his suitcase, and began counting them once again in order to make sure they were all there. Paddington had had an account with the local branch of Floyd's for some time, but although he occasionally paid them a visit in order to have a chat with the manager and to make sure everything was all right, it wasn't often he had the opportunity to put any actual money in, and he was looking forward to the event. The notes were crisp and new, and rather difficult to separate with paws, so in no time at all he became lost to the outside world, and it wasn't until a shadow fell across the pavement that he realised anyone else was about. Hurriedly stuffing the money under his duffel coat, Paddington looked up to meet the gaze of a tall, rather distinguished-looking man in a black overcoat and bowler hat. The man raised his hat politely. "Pardon me, Bear," he said. "I couldn't help noticing what you were doing, and I wondered if we were here on the same mission." Not to be outdone, Paddington jumped to his feet, still clutching the money tightly beneath a fold in his duffel coat, and raised his own hat with a free paw. "I don't think I'm here on a mission," he replied. "I've come to put my money in the bank." "Look after the pennies," said the man approvingly, "and the pounds will look after themselves. That's what I always say." "Oh, they're not pennies," said Paddington importantly. "They're pounds. I won over 100 on a ship sweep." £100? Echoed the man with interest. "You don't mean to tell me you're putting it all in the bank?" "Not all £100, said Paddington. "I want to save part of it to buy some presents. The man took hold of Paddington's arm and led him a little way along the street. "What a good thing we met," he exclaimed. "Must have been fate." He looked all around and then lowered his voice confidingly. "Now, if you told me you're taking your money out, I'd have understood. Between you and me and the gatepost, all's not well with Floyd's." Paddington's eyes grew larger as he listened. What?" he exclaimed hotly. "All's not well with Floyd's?" "Shh!" The man put his fingers to his lips as he drew Paddington to a nearby doorway. "Not too loud, Bear," he said hastily. "You might start to panic, and then there's no knowing what'll happen." He peered out into the street and then eyed Paddington thoughtfully, as if trying to make up his mind whether he could trust him or not. "You look like a bear of the world," he said at last. "I wonder, can you tell me what we're standing on at this moment?" Paddington looked more surprised at the question. "A paving stone," he answered promptly. "Aha," said the man. "But can you tell me what's underneath that?" "Earth," said Paddington doubtfully. The man gave a chuckle and then withdrew a small glass phial of dark liquid from an inside pocket. "I'll let you into a secret, Bear," he said as he held it up to the light. "Oil. That's what we're standing on. Millions of pounds worth of oil." He pointed towards a dark patch on the road nearby. 99 people out of 100, he continued, would say that it dripped from a car. They don't realize it's seeping up through the ground under their very feet. I tell you, anyone who buys a share in the Portobello Oil Company now is going to make a fortune out of the interest alone. "The Portobello Oil Company?" exclaimed Paddington. "I don't think I've ever heard of that before." The man felt in his pocket again. "Not many people have," he replied. "It hasn't been going very long. Look here, Bear," he said as he held out a piece of paper. "I must say I've taken a liking to you. These shares are really worth £110 each, but I think I could manage to let you have one at 100. Paddington looked at the man doubtfully. "It's very kind of you," he said, "but I don't think I can afford £100. I really want to buy some presents as well." "Nonsense," said the man briskly, as he crossed off the word 110 on the piece of paper and wrote in the word 100. "You'll be able to buy all the presents you need with the interest and more besides." Before Paddington had a chance to even open his mouth, let alone say anything, he found himself clutching the share while the man quickly transferred the bundle of notes from his paw to an inside pocket. "Now don't forget," he warned, "not a word to anyone. I don't want the news to get round, at least not until the Derricks arrive, and then you can tell anyone you like." "The Derricks?" repeated Paddington. "The oil drilling equipment," explained the man. "I have to go and see about them this morning." "When do I collect my interest?" asked Paddington anxiously. The man chuckled. "I can see you have an eye for business," he said. "A bear after my own heart. If you care to meet me here tomorrow morning, same time, same place, I'll see what I can do. But remember," he whispered, "keep it under your hat. We don't want the bottom to drop out of the market." With that, he gave a final wave of his rolled umbrella and then hurried off up the Portobello Road, leaving Paddington standing on the pavement looking at his piece of paper with an excited gleam in his eyes. It was an impressive-looking document, covered with a flowery sort of print, which was rather difficult to read. Studying it, he was just able to make out the words Portobello Oil Company across the top, but underneath, the print was so small and there was so much of it, he soon decided he'd have to take it home and examine it more closely at his leisure. Remembering the man's instructions, he folded the piece of paper carefully into four and then placed it under his hat for safety. Paddington had never owned any sort of share before, let alone £100 one in an oil company, and he felt most important as he made his way back along the road. All the same, he trod very carefully when he crossed over to the other side in the direction of the shops. Apart from telling him to keep the matter under his hat, the man had also said something about not wanting the bottoms to drop out of the market, and he wasn't the sort of bear to take any unnecessary chances. When he reached the other side of the road, Paddington hesitated for a moment outside the window of a small store. There was a thoughtful expression on his face as he peered through the glass at the various items on display. Although he had brought home several small presents for the Browns, he was anxious to buy them something really nice in return for their kindness in paying for his trip to Peru. With the interest on his new share, Paddington felt sure he'd be able to buy some very good presents indeed, and he felt equally certain that the owner of the shop would be only too pleased to wait until the next day for his money, for despite his habit of driving a hard bargain, all the shopkeepers and the other dealers in the market held Paddington in very high regard. With the promise of riches to come, Paddington took rather longer over his shopping that morning than he'd first intended, and by the time he reached Mr. Gruber's antique shop for elevenses, his friend was already waiting anxiously outside. "I began to think you weren't coming, Mr. Brown," he exclaimed. "I had to put a saucer over your mug so that the cocoa wouldn't get cold." Paddington sank gratefully into one of the deck chairs on the pavement, while Mr. Gruber bustled around setting a tray of buns on a nearby table. "I've been buying a few coming-home presents, Mr. Gruber," he explained. Mr. Gruber looked at him reprovingly over the top of his glasses. "It's very thoughtful of you, Mr. Brown," he said, "and I'm sure everyone will be most grateful. But I hope you've left yourself some money to put in the bank for a rainy day. There have been one or two rather nasty cases of fraud in the market just lately," he continued, before Paddington could reply. "I was very pleased this morning when you told me you were putting your money in a safe place." Mr. Gruber settled himself in a deck chair alongside Paddington and sipped his cork. "It seems as if someone has been going around selling false shares for a firm called the Portobello Oil Company. You'll find this difficult to believe, Mr. Brown, but one or two foolish people have actually bought one." Mr. Gruber looked at Paddington with some concern as a loud chalking sound came from behind his cork mug. "I do hope it's not too hot, Mr. Brown," he exclaimed. It's all right, Mr. Gruber," gasped Paddington hastily. "I was having trouble with one of my buns, and I think a current must have gone down the wrong way." Mr. Gruber gave Paddington a pat on the back and then settled himself once again in order to resume his story. "The man they're after," he said, "is called Jim the Dandy." "Jim the Dandy?" echoed Paddington, looking more and more worried. "That's right," said Mr. Gruber. "They call him that because of the way he dresses, just like someone who works in the city, in fact. You'll have a job to tell him from the real thing. I hope they catch him soon," he continued. "Otherwise he'll begin to give the market a bad name. I was talking to a policeman only yesterday, and he agreed with me that there's only one thing worse than selling something that isn't there to sell, and that's buying something and not paying for it." Mr. Gruber shook his head sadly. "There's been quite a bit of that going on just lately too, Mr. Brown," he added. "But I'm pleased to say the police are hot on the trail of the culprits. I only hope when they do catch up with him that he'll get what they deserve." Mr. Gruber broke off as before his astonished gaze Paddington suddenly jumped out of his chair, removed his overcoat and hastily bundled it over his pile of shopping. "Are you sure you're feeling all right, Mr. Brown?" he asked anxiously. "I must say you don't look too good." Paddington gave a worried glance up and down the market. "I'm all right, thank you very much, Mr. Gruber," he said mysteriously, "but I'm not too sure about things in general." Mr. Gruber knew better than to inquire into matters which might be difficult to explain. All the same, he began to look more and more concerned as Paddington slumped back into his chair, leaving a half-eaten bun untouched on the plate by his side. But if Mr. Gruber looked worried, Paddington himself was even more woe-begone. His face had been long enough to start with, but it lengthened still further some while later as he made his way back towards Windsor Gardens and had time to consider all that had happened that morning. By the time he reached the familiar green front door of number 32, his face had fallen to its longest ever, but by then his hat was pulled down so well over his forehead, and his head had sunk so low onto his shoulders, that only the closest observer would have noticed anything amiss. Paddington lifted the brim of his hat, gave one last worried glance up and down Windsor Gardens, and then disappeared from view, closing the door behind him with a loud click which seemed to suggest that one member of the Brown family at least wouldn't be receiving any more visitors that day.